There's a point where awareness stops feeling like progress. Not suddenly, not in a way that immediately concerns you. At first, it feels like an achievement. You understand your patterns. You can explain your reactions. You see where your behavior comes from, why you respond the way you do, what triggers you, what influences you, and this gives you a sense of control. You are no longer confused in the same way. You are not reacting blindly. You are observing yourself as it happens. You can step back, analyze, interpret. You know what is going on. But then something subtle begins to shift. You start noticing that nothing is actually changing. The same situations repeat. The same reactions appear. The same decisions lead to the same outcomes. And yet, this time, you are fully aware of it. You see the pattern clearly while you are inside it. And that is where the discomfort begins. Because you can no longer say, I didn't know. Now you know. And still it happens. This creates a different kind of tension. Not confusion. Not ignorance. But a gap between what you understand and how you live. You may notice this in very ordinary situations. A conversation where you recognize your reaction before it fully unfolds. You see the irritation forming, the defensive tone, the subtle shift in your posture. You know exactly why it is happening. You can even trace it back to past experiences, to patterns you have already analyzed many times. And yet, the reaction still moves forward, almost on its own. Or consider a situation where you make a decision you already know is not aligned. You see it clearly. You even think about it as it happens. This is not what I actually want. And still, you follow through, not because you are unaware, but because awareness alone does not interrupt the movement. This is where things begin to feel strange. Because for a long time, you believed that understanding was the key. If you could just see clearly enough, things would change. If you could identify the pattern, you could move beyond it. But now, that belief starts to lose its certainty. You see clearly and nothing shifts. And that creates a kind of quiet frustration. Not intense, not overwhelming, but persistent. You may begin to notice a pattern in your own thinking. You explain things to yourself constantly. You interpret your behavior in real time. You can break down almost any situation into its psychological components. But this process starts to feel repetitive, circular. You are not discovering anything new. You are confirming what you already know. And at some point, that confirmation stops feeling useful. It feels like you are watching yourself from a distance, without actually changing direction. This can also show up in how you engage with information. You listen to ideas, concepts, explanations, and you recognize them immediately. I already know this. I've already thought about this. I've already understood this. And while that recognition may feel satisfying first, it slowly begins to lose its impact because knowing is no longer enough. You may even start to feel a kind of detachment from the process of learning itself, not because you have nothing left to learn, but because you're no longer convinced that more understanding will change anything. This is where many people become stuck without realizing it, not in confusion, but in awareness. They reach a point where they can see everything clearly, but remain in the same patterns. And this creates a subtle illusion, the illusion of progress, because awareness feels like movement. It feels like something is happening, but in reality, the structure remains the same. The behavior continues. The patterns repeat. Only now they are fully visible. This is why the experience can feel so difficult to describe, because from the outside, it looks like growth. You are self-aware. You are reflective. You understand yourself. But from the inside, something feels incomplete, as if you are circling around something without ever fully moving through it. And this is where the question begins to change. It is no longer, why is this happening? You already know why. The question becomes, why does knowing not change anything? And that question is much harder to answer because it challenges something deeper, the assumption that awareness is enough. You may start noticing that your mind has become very skilled at understanding. It can analyze quickly. It can interpret accurately. It can connect patterns and meanings with ease. But this skill, instead of creating transformation, begins to create distance. You are no longer inside the experience in the same way. You are observing it, explaining it, sometimes even predicting it. And yet, The experience itself remains unchanged. This creates a kind of split. Part of you is aware, part of you is still acting, and the two are not fully integrated. You can see what is happening, but you are not yet able to live differently in relation to it. This is where the process becomes more confronting, because you can no longer rely on lack of awareness as an explanation. You are no longer unconscious of your patterns, and yet they persist. This is not failure. It is not a lack of effort. It is something more subtle, something that only becomes visible at this stage, when awareness is no longer enough, and something deeper is required. At this stage, something needs to be understood very precisely. The mind's ability to understand is not neutral. It does not only reveal the truth, it can also protect you from it. Carl Jung was very clear about this distinction. He observed that the psyche does not simply move toward awareness in a linear way. It resists. It defends itself. It reorganizes in order to maintain stability. And one of the most subtle ways it does this is through insight itself. What you are experiencing is not a failure of awareness. It is the beginning of seeing how awareness can be used by the ego. In Jungian psychology, the ego is the center of conscious identity. It organizes your experience, gives you a sense of continuity, and maintains a certain structure in how you relate to yourself and the world. But the ego also has a fundamental function. It protects itself, not in an aggressive way, in a stabilizing way. It avoids anything that threatens its current structure. And real transformation does exactly that. It destabilizes the patterns the ego is built on. It challenges the way you see yourself. It disrupts the consistency of your identity. And because of this, the ego does not always allow transformation to happen easily. Instead, it finds ways to remain in control. One of those ways is through intellectualization. Jung did not use this term lightly. He understood that the psyche can convert experience into thought as a way of avoiding direct confrontation with it. You explain instead of feel. You analyze instead of engage. You interpret instead of act. And this creates a very convincing illusion, because from the outside, it looks like awareness. You can describe your emotions. You can identify your patterns. You can even predict your own reactions. But internally, something remains untouched. The structure of your behavior does not change, because it has not been fully experienced. It has only been understood. This is where the gap begins to make sense. You are not stuck because you lack insight. You are stuck because insight has replaced something else. Direct confrontation. Consider how this appears in real life. You feel a certain emotion, maybe irritation, insecurity, or tension. Almost immediately, your mind steps in. You label it. You explain it. You trace it back to its origin. And in doing so, you create distance from it. The emotion is no longer something you are inside. It becomes something you are observing. And while this observation feels like clarity, it also prevents something deeper from happening, because emotion is not fully lived. It is processed cognitively. And this is the key distinction. Jung emphasized that transformation requires integration, not just recognition. The unconscious material must not only be seen, but experienced, confronted, and allowed to unfold within consciousness. When this does not happen, the pattern remains intact. Only now, it is accompanied by awareness. This is why you can see your behavior clearly and still repeat it. The insight exists at one level. The pattern exists at another, and the two are not yet connected. There is also another layer to this. The ego begins to identify with being aware. You may not notice it immediately, but it develops gradually. You see yourself as someone who understands, someone who reflects, someone who has insight into psychological processes. And this identity becomes important because it gives you a sense of progress, a sense of distinction, but it also creates a new form of attachment. You become attached to understanding itself. And this attachment can subtly block transformation, because if your identity is built around understanding, there's less incentive to move beyond it. Understanding becomes the goal, not change. This is where Jung's idea of ego inflation becomes relevant, not in the obvious sense of arrogance, but in a more refined form. The belief that awareness alone places you above your patterns. that seeing clearly is equivalent to being free from what you see. But in reality, the opposite is often true. The more clearly you see a pattern, the more you realize how deeply it is embedded. And this realization can be uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of control. You begin to understand that the psyche is not easily transformed through thought alone. It requires something more demanding, something less controlled, something that cannot be reduced to explanation. This is why Jung placed such importance on the unconscious, because the unconscious does not respond to analysis in the same way the conscious mind does. It does not change because you understand it. It changes when it is brought into conscious experience and allowed to interact with awareness directly. And that interaction is not always comfortable. It involves tension, contradiction, moments where you cannot immediately resolve what you are experiencing. This is precisely what the ego tries to avoid. And this is why it prefers understanding, because understanding creates closure. It gives the impression that something has been resolved, even when it has not. So what you are encountering now is not a lack of knowledge. It is the limit of knowledge as a tool for transformation. You have reached a point where seeing is no longer enough, where explanation does not dissolve the pattern, where awareness reveals a structure, but does not yet change it. And this is not a dead end. It is a transition, a necessary one, because it forces a shift from thinking about your experience to being fully present within it, from observing at a distance to engaging directly. And this shift is not something the mind can fully control. It requires a different kind of participation, one that goes beyond understanding. A different kind of shift begins when you stop relying on understanding to do the work for you, not by rejecting insight, but by noticing where it ends. There is a moment where you see the pattern forming, and instead of immediately explaining it, you stay with it. You don't label it. You don't analyze it. You let it unfold. And that is where something new starts to happen. Because for the first time, you are not stepping outside the experience. You are inside it, fully. This may sound simple, but it is not easy, because what you encounter in that moment is not clarity. It is tension. You feel the impulse to react. You feel the familiar movement of the pattern, the urge to say something, to withdraw, to defend, to repeat what you have always done. And at the same time, you are aware of it, not conceptually, directly. You feel it as it happens. And instead of immediately resolving that tension through explanation, you allow it to exist. This is where transformation begins. Not when you understand the pattern, but when you experience it without escaping into interpretation. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation requires the capacity to hold opposites, to remain present between what you know and what you feel, without collapsing one into the other. And this is exactly what you are doing in that moment. Part of you recognizes a pattern. Another part is still inside it. And instead of choosing one over the other, you stay with both. This creates something the ego is not used to, a lack of immediate control. There is no quick resolution, no clear answer, just awareness and experience coexisting. And this is uncomfortable, because it removes a familiar structure of explanation. You cannot solve the moment. You can only go through it. But this is also what makes it real, because the unconscious does not change through explanation. It changes through experience, through repetition of a different kind, not repeating the same behavior, but repeating the act of staying present instead of escaping. You may notice that this begins in small ways, a reaction that you feel fully without immediately acting on it, a conversation where you notice your usual pattern, but do not follow it completely, a moment where you allow silence instead of filling it with familiar response. These moments may seem insignificant, but they are not, because they interrupt the automatic cycle, not by force, but by presence. And over time, this creates a shift. The pattern does not disappear immediately, but it loses its inevitability. It no longer feels like something that simply happens to you. It becomes something you can relate to differently. This is where awareness starts to become embodied. It is no longer something you think about. It becomes something you live through. And this changes your relationship with yourself. You stop expecting immediate change. You stop measuring progress through understanding. Instead, you begin to notice subtle differences. A slightly longer pause before reacting. A slightly weaker intensity. in familiar emotions, a growing ability to remain present without needing to resolve everything immediately. This is how transformation actually unfolds, slowly, quietly, through repeated contact with experience, not through conceptual clarity. There's also something else that begins to shift: your relationship with control. At earlier stages, you may have believed that awareness would give you control over your patterns, that once you understood them, you could change them at will. But now, you begin to see that control is not the mechanism. Awareness is not about controlling the psyche. It is about relating to it differently. And that difference is subtle but decisive. You are no longer trying to eliminate parts of yourself. You are allowing them to be seen without being dominated by them. This creates a new kind of stability, not based on certainty, but on presence. You are able to remain with what is happening, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is unclear, even when it does not resolve immediately. And this capacity is what gradually transforms the structure itself. Jung did not describe individuation as a process of fixing behavior. He described it as a process of becoming conscious. And consciousness, in this sense, is not just awareness. It is awareness that remains present under pressure, awareness that does not retreat into explanation, awareness that can stay with contradiction without needing to dissolve it immediately. This is what you are developing, not a better understanding, but a deeper relationship with your own experience. And from that relationship, change emerges naturally, not forced, not imposed, but as a result of seeing and experiencing the same pattern in a different way over time. So if you find yourself in this stage where you understand everything but feel stuck, the next step is not more insight. It is more presence, more willingness to stay with what you already see, without immediately turning it into something you can explain, because that is where the shift happens, not in knowing more, but in experiencing differently. There's a moment where something becomes impossible to ignore. You can no longer convince yourself that understanding is the same as change. For a long time, it felt that way. Each new insight gave you a sense of movement. Each realization felt like progress. You could see more clearly, think more precisely, explain more accurately, and that created a quiet confidence, the belief that you were moving forward. But now, that belief has been challenged, not because your understanding was wrong, but because it was incomplete. You reached a point where insight stopped producing results, where clarity stopped translating into action, where awareness revealed everything, and still left you in the same place. And that realization is not comfortable, because it removes a certain illusion, the illusion that thinking is enough. Carl Jung never suggested that awareness alone would transform the psyche. He saw awareness as the beginning, not the end, a doorway, not the destination. And what lies beyond that doorway is something less controlled, less predictable, something that cannot be reduced to explanation. It requires participation. It requires presence. It requires going through the experience instead of standing outside of it. And this is where the real work begins, not in collecting more insight, but in allowing what you already see to affect how you live. Because the truth is, you already know more than enough. You see your patterns. You recognize your reactions. You understand the structure of your behavior. The question is no longer, what is happening? The question is, am I willing to stay with it when it happens? That is where the difference is made, not in knowing, but in what you do with what you know. And that does not mean forcing yourself to change. It means not escaping the moment through explanation. It means allowing yourself to experience the tension fully, without immediately resolving it, because that is where something shifts. Not instantly, not dramatically, but in a way that is real. Before we close, consider something carefully. Think about a situation you understand very well, a pattern you can explain in detail, a reaction you have analyzed many times. The next time it appears, will you observe it from a distance, or will you stay inside it long enough to feel it without turning it into a thought? That choice is small, but it changes everything. If this resonates, write in the comments one pattern you fully understand but have not yet changed. Not to judge it, not to fix it immediately, just to recognize it clearly. And if you know someone who is highly self-aware but feels stuck in the same cycles, share this video with them. Because sometimes the next step is not more knowledge. It is learning how to stop hiding behind it. See you in the next video.